The question of what Soviet people ate in a single day reveals far more than a simple inventory of meals. It exposes the architecture of an entire social system, the priorities of a command economy, and the daily reality of life behind the Iron Curtain for nearly 300 million people across 7 decades. Food in the Soviet Union was never just sustenance. It was ideology made edible, a reflection of central planning, industrial production, and the state's promise to provide for its citizens from cradle to grave. To understand what filled Soviet plates is to understand how the state attempted to engineer not just an economy, but a way of life. The morning in a Soviet household began with breakfast, and this was not optional. The culture of the Soviet workplace demanded punctuality, productivity, and endurance. Factories operated on strict shifts. Offices opened early. Schools began promptly. To skip breakfast was to risk exhaustion before the lunch break, and exhaustion meant reduced output, which meant failing the collective. Breakfast was therefore a ritual of preparation, a fueling station before the day's labor. The menu was remarkably consistent across millions of households, from Leningrad to Vladivostok. Oatmeal or semolina porridge formed the foundation, often cooked with milk when available, sometimes with water when it was not. Eggs, either fried or boiled, provided protein. Sausage, a staple of Soviet food production, appeared on sandwiches made with dense black bread, the kind that could sustain a worker through hours of physical labor. Black tea, strong and hot, was the universal beverage, sometimes sweetened with sugar, sometimes taken plain. For those with a sweet tooth, sliced bread spread with homemade jam offered a small indulgence, a taste of something beyond the utilitarian. The simplicity of Soviet breakfast was not accidental. It was designed for speed and efficiency. The Soviet system did not accommodate leisurely mornings. Women, who bore the dual burden of full-time employment and domestic labor, had little time to prepare elaborate meals before rushing to work themselves. The state promoted female participation in the workforce as a matter of socialist principle. By the 1970s, women constituted over 50% of the Soviet labor force, one of the highest rates in the world. But this liberation came with a cost. Housework remained largely their responsibility, and the morning routine reflected this tension. Porridge could be prepared in minutes. Eggs cooked quickly. Sandwiches required no cooking at all. The system demanded efficiency, and breakfast delivered it. On weekends, when time expanded slightly, the menu could shift. Sirniki, those small fried patties made from cottage cheese, eggs, and flour, appeared on tables. Blini, the thin crepes that could be filled with jam, sour cream, or savory fillings, became a weekend tradition. These dishes required more attention, more time standing at the stove, and therefore they marked the boundary between the work week and the brief respite from it. Even in something as simple as breakfast, the rhythm of Soviet life asserted itself. Lunch was the centerpiece of the Soviet day, and for most people, it was eaten away from home. The canteen system was one of the most pervasive institutions of Soviet life, a network of subsidized cafeterias that fed workers, students, soldiers, and bureaucrats across the entire country. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union operated over 200,000 canteens, serving tens of millions of meals daily. These were not restaurants. They were extensions of the workplace, designed to keep people fed, keep them on schedule, and keep them productive. The canteen was where the state's promise of universal provision became tangible, where the rhetoric of socialism met the reality of a plate of food. The structure of the Soviet lunch was rigidly standardized, a three-course progression that remained nearly identical whether you were eating in a Moscow factory or a Siberian mining town. The first course, known simply as pervoya, meaning the first, was always soup. Soup was sacred in Soviet cuisine, a culinary anchor that transcended regional differences. Borscht, shchi, solyanka, rasolnik. These were not mere dishes but cultural institutions, recipes passed down through generations, adapted to the ingredients available under central planning. Soup was economical, stretching vegetables, grains, and small amounts of meat into a filling dish that could feed many. It was warm, essential, in a country where winter dominated much of the calendar. And it was familiar, a taste of home even in the impersonal setting of a canteen. The second course, vituroye, was the main event, the protein-heavy centerpiece designed to sustain physical labor. Macaroni and sausage, mashed potatoes with a cutlet, rice and fish. These combinations appeared with rhythmic regularity. The cutlet, or kotleta, deserves particular attention. In Soviet cuisine, a kotleta was not a cut of meat, but a ground meat patty, often extended with bread soaked in milk or water to make the meat go further. This was not deception, but necessity. Meat was expensive to produce and often in short supply. The Soviet state prioritized heavy industry over agriculture for much of its existence, a choice with profound consequences for the dinner table. Under Stalin's first five-year plan, launched in 1928, the forced collectivization of agriculture aimed to extract resources from the countryside to fuel industrialization. The result was catastrophic. The famine of 1932 to 1933 killed millions, particularly in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus. Even after recovery, Soviet agriculture never achieved the productivity of Western farming. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union, with some of the richest farmland in the world, was importing grain from the United States and Canada. The kotleta, stretched with bread, was a small echo of this larger struggle. Fish appeared regularly on Soviet menus, more so than in many Western diets. This was partly a matter of geography. The Soviet Union controlled vast fishing fleets and extensive coastlines along the Arctic, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. But it was also ideological. Soviet nutritionists promoted fish as a healthy, affordable source of protein, and the state invested heavily in fish processing and canning. Canned fish, particularly sprats, sardines, and salmon, became pantry staples, reliable and shelf-stable, suited to the logistical challenges of feeding a population spread across 11 time zones. Alongside the second course came salad, though the Soviet concept of salad differed markedly from Western interpretations. Vegetable salads, simple combinations of cucumbers, tomatoes, and onions dressed with sunflower oil, provided freshness when produce was available. But the more iconic Soviet salads were substantial, almost meals in themselves. Olivier salad, known in the West as Russian salad, combined boiled potatoes, carrots, eggs, pickles, peas, and bologna-style sausage, all bound together with mayonnaise. Herring under a fur coat layered salted herring with boiled vegetables and mayonnaise, a dish as visually striking as it was filling. These salads were not light appetizers but dense, caloric contributions to the meal, reflecting a cuisine shaped by scarcity and the need to stretch ingredients. The meal concluded with a drink, typically compote or mors. Compote was a lightly sweetened beverage made by simmering dried or fresh fruits in water, a way to preserve the flavors of summer berries and orchard fruits through the long winter. Mors, made from berry juice diluted with water, served a similar purpose. These drinks were practical solutions to the limited availability of fresh fruit outside the growing season and the expense of imported tropical fruits. They were also cultural markers, tastes associated with childhood, with home, with the continuity of Russian and Soviet culinary tradition. Between lunch and dinner lay a uniquely Soviet institution known as poldnik, literally meaning half-day, a snack timed for late afternoon. While the British observed their 5 o'clock tea, Soviet citizens, particularly children, participated in poldnik. This was especially important in kindergartens and schools, where nutritionists calculated that growing children required additional calories to bridge the gap between lunch and dinner. The menu was simple but deliberate. Kefir, a fermented milk drink with a tangy taste and probiotic properties, was the cornerstone. Biscuits, cookies, or waffles provided carbohydrates. Apples or other seasonal fruits, when available, added vitamins. For adults, poldnik was less formalized, often just tea or coffee with cookies, a brief pause in the workday, or a moment of rest at home. The existence of poldnik reveals the Soviet state's paternalistic approach to nutrition, the belief that proper eating could and should be engineered, that the state knew best how to fuel its citizens. Dinner, the final meal of the day, was almost always eaten at home. Restaurants existed in the Soviet Union, but they were few, expensive, and often reserved for special occasions or for entertaining foreign guests. The typical Soviet family could not afford regular restaurant meals, nor did the culture encourage it. The home was the center of social life, and the kitchen table was its heart. This placed enormous pressure on Soviet women, who were expected to work full-time and then rush home to prepare dinner. The double burden of labor and domestic responsibility was a persistent contradiction in Soviet society, a gap between the ideal of gender equality and the reality of lived experience. To manage this burden, Soviet housewives developed strategies of efficiency. Cooking in advance became standard practice. A large pot of soup could feed a family for several days. Cutlets could be made in batches and reheated. This meant that dinner often resembled lunch in its composition. The same soups, the same second courses, the same salads reappearing across multiple meals. The repetition was not monotony but pragmatism, a way to navigate the constraints of time, energy, and the limitations of Soviet food supply. The quick meal options for dinner reflected these constraints. Macaroni with canned fish or canned meat required minimal preparation. Pelmeni, those small dumplings filled with ground meat, were often made in large quantities and frozen, ready to be boiled when needed. Pelmeni making was sometimes a family or communal activity, with multiple people gathering to fold hundreds of dumplings at once. A social event that doubled as meal preparation. Canned fish with bread, simple and unadorned, was a fallback when time or ingredients ran short. These were not gourmet meals, but they were reliable. And reliability mattered in a system where food availability could be unpredictable. The predictability of the Soviet diet, its repetitive rhythms and standardized meals, was both a strength and a limitation. On one hand, it reflected a system that guaranteed basic nutrition to its citizens, a significant achievement in a country that had experienced devastating famines within living memory. The Soviet state provided subsidized food, controlled prices, and maintained a network of canteens and stores that ensured most people could eat regularly. Hunger, in the acute sense, was largely eliminated after the immediate post-war period. This was not trivial. In the 1920s and 30s, millions had starved. By the 1970s, starvation was a memory, not a present threat. But the system had profound weaknesses. The command economy, with its 5-year plans and centralized production targets, was ill-suited to the complexities of agriculture and food distribution. Factories could produce tractors and tanks with relative efficiency, but food was different. Crops depended on weather, soil, and timing. Livestock required care and feed. Distribution required refrigeration, and transportation infrastructure that the Soviet Union struggled to maintain. The result was chronic inefficiency, waste, and shortages. Fresh produce was often unavailable outside the growing season. Meat was rationed or simply absent from stores. Lines formed outside shops whenever desirable goods appeared. The Soviet citizen learned to shop opportunistically, buying what was available rather than what was needed, stockpiling when possible. The contrast with the West became increasingly stark as the Cold War progressed. American supermarkets, with their abundance and variety, became symbols of capitalist prosperity, tools of propaganda that needed no exaggeration. Soviet citizens who traveled abroad or saw Western films returned with stories of overflowing shelves, exotic fruits available year-round, dozens of brands competing for attention. The kitchen debate of 1959, when Vice President Richard Nixon and Premier Nikita Khrushchev argued in a model American kitchen at an exhibition in Moscow, crystallized this competition. Nixon pointed to labor-saving appliances and consumer choice. Khrushchev defended Soviet achievements in housing and education. But the image of abundance, of choice, of variety, lingered. By the 1980s, the gap between promise and reality had widened into a chasm. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, were driven partly by the recognition that the Soviet system was failing to deliver on its basic commitments. Food shortages worsened, the state's ability to subsidize prices eroded. The social contract, the implicit bargain that citizens would accept political restrictions in exchange for economic security, began to fracture. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the food supply was one of the many systems that disintegrated, leading to hardship and dislocation that scarred a generation. What Soviet people ate in a day was never just about nutrition. It was about how a state organized itself, what it prioritized, and what it could deliver. The standardized meals, the reliance on canteens, the simplicity and repetition, all of these reflected a system that valued order, efficiency, and collective provision, but struggled with flexibility, quality, and individual choice. The Soviet diet was a product of ideology, geography, history, and the constraints of a planned economy. It fed hundreds of millions of people for decades, preventing the mass starvation that had plagued earlier eras, but it could not match the abundance that became the hallmark of developed market economies. The legacy of Soviet food culture persists today across the former Soviet states, in the continued popularity of borscht and pelmeni, in the nostalgia for certain tastes and textures, and in the memory of a system that promised much, delivered some, and ultimately could not sustain itself. The meals eaten at Soviet tables were modest, often monotonous, but they were also deeply human, shaped by the hands of millions of women who cooked them, the workers who ate them, and the vast, flawed experiment in social engineering that made them possible.